Hello everyone, my name's Zenitsu, and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today we actually have a ban and restriction update. So if anyone's unfamiliar with bans and restrictions, it just changes the legality of cards and how much you could use them, because these cards are overperforming and too powerful and having a profound impact on the game, more so in the negative aspect. So the ban and restriction list is here to kind of clean up the game and make it a better overall experience. So we have some new bans and restrictions that are going to be taking into effect for both EN and JP on August 31st, so basically at the end of the month. And I'm going to be going over each of the cards and kind of breaking down why Bandai decided to hit them and kind of just translate like Bandaiese into something a little bit more understandable as for why the card got limited in the first place. So let's just dive right into this and see what actually got banned and limited. Obviously, starting with the very first card, we have Ukkomon. So this is the promo version of Ukkomon. It looks like they're leaving the BT16 Ukkomon completely untouched. It's just the other one is a little bit more balanced, actually having an evolution cost, versus this one literally just being a free card to digivolve into, giving you a free egg when you move it out or another Digimon out of the raising area, and giving you a free memory for doing so, and that's just a really powerful set of abilities to be playing with. So as far as what their description is, I'm kind of not going to read it. You could read it for yourself. Basically, it was supposed to interact with the promo Louie in a lot of decks, but it was overperforming in terms of its overall importance for a lot of decks. They specifically state control decks that don't require level 3s, but more than just control decks that don't require level 3s were able to abuse this card, more so on the aggro side because we get a turbo out our raising area thanks to Ukkomon's ability. But the fact that it was just driving overall deck diversity down is the big problem on why they decided to limit the card, because it was just too cannibalistic in terms of the decks that were viable because they could run it, and the abilities that it has, accelerating the game state with promo Louie in mind. Speaking of promo Louie, we actually have promo Louie on this list also getting limited to 1. So promo Louie is just an absolutely insane card because of the fact that it can force Digimon out of your raising or breeding area, and then that allows you to trigger your abilities that might not be once per turn, like the BT6 Mat Ishida, so that way you could kind of just being able to constantly spawn a Digimon out of raising and gain enough memory to maintain turn. And that's kind of what's making this card overperform, is that on top of the fact that it's also gaining you a memory for when your Digimon are moving out of the raising or breeding area, which just makes it a very efficient tamer to use to also close out games with or just help accelerate board states. Then, when it comes to the next card on the list, this is one that actually caught me off guard. I really wasn't expecting Hammer Spark from the second starter deck to actually get hit by this list. All of the other cards on this list were kind of expected in some way, shape, or form, impacting the decks that are obviously playing them at the high competitive level to try to fix it and shake up the meta a little bit, because it doesn't look like the meta without this was really going to be changing a whole lot, and that wasn't necessarily good for the overall health of the game. So Hammer Spark kind of is the blue representative. A lot of people really wanted Mirage to get hit, but they decided to go with Hammer Spark instead, more so to try to stem the Ancient deck, because obviously this is one of the cards that helps to facilitate Ancient Garurumon in both Gabumon and in his own base build, just because it does need some extra memory to be able to get itself off the ground, and Hammer Spark was there to not only just help facilitate that, because both those decks draw a metric butt ton for free, mind you, do, but they also needed that extra memory for their combo play. So the next card on the list is going to be Awakening of the Golden Knight from BT9. So obviously this card just allows you to utilize Numon X Antibody really easily. When this card was initially designed, it was meant for the BT9 Numon X Antibody, but because we have the new one that also is a Numon X Antibody, it just makes this card even easier to use to get into that powerful card as quickly as possible. They state that it's also supposedly because of the cost reduction or memory generation on the rookie level to be able to help it accelerate this overall game plan, just because you could move out the Digimon Digivolve for free or relatively cheap, and then utilize this option to get into a fast level 6 that's going to have lots of different immunities that you could keep immune because the opponent's defenses aren't exactly built up yet. So it's just a card to help stem the overall aggressive capabilities of what Numon X Antibody is supposed to do, so decks actually have a chance to be able to respond to it. And then the next card on the list, to nobody's surprise, is something from the Numemon deck. They decided to just continue the trend on hitting low-level X antibodies and just went for Numemon X Antibody versus Monzemon X Antibody, even though as a person who understands the deck at a high competitive level, Monzemon is actually the stronger card. But it seems like they decided to go just with Numemon to try to keep the deck in a somewhat playable state, even though the loss of Ukkomon and the loss of Numemon X is going to slow down the deck quite a lot because you don't have that turbo raising area plays. It makes, by extension, Monzemon X a little bit worse just because it's going to be slower to get extra bodies out, on top of the fact that the deck already is going to be slowing down because you get a free extra card draw with how the eggs work for digivolving Numemon X on top of your Numemons before you even do anything and invested any memory in. So those are all not exactly the reasons why they listed Numemon X. That's just my interpretation, understanding the deck, and the real reason why they gave is because it gives a really sticky board state relatively quickly that allows you to easily go up into a level 6, which is true because it brings back the Platinum Numemon, and it only takes a Jerry in your opening hand to discard it to put it into the trash to be able to line it up as early as turn 2, and then because you're just sitting on a level 6, it just allows you to have easy access at going up into a level 7 for even more control to lock the opponent out of the game at relatively early stages. Then when it comes to the next card on the list, we got BT14-TK Takaishi. So if anyone has known me, I've always been complaining about the yellow vaccine package since literally BT14 when it was introduced because of the level of acceleration that this card gives. It definitely seems like TK was one of, if not the most problematic card next to Emissary of Hope in the engine. Patamon itself is already really strong, but it is RNG dependent. Same thing with Emissary, and TK is the glue that binds them together to allow you to actually make those inconsistent cards because they do require a little bit of luck on being able to have no real way to set it up outside of TK. So you are going to have to high roll if you're going to want to utilize those cards, and the deck still definitely can. It's just a lot slower because of this, especially since the fact that multiple TKs can just give you more value over time and trigger certain abilities that, like when cards go in and out of security for a relatively cheap cost, because he's at least going to be gaining you a memory because he sees himself take a card out of security and put one back in, so that will trigger his ability, making him essentially a 2-costed tamer that actually is supposed to cost 3. Then, when it comes to the last card on the list, we actually got a card lifted from the ban and restriction list. So, it's not necessarily super often that we get cards removed from the ban and restriction list. I'm personally opposed to most cards coming off because the card was so powerful that it got on there for a reason and should stay on there for a reason. But Gabumon is less of a problem just because of the environmental shift in the game, because way back when in like EX5, when decks were actually abusing this card, it was relatively easy to be able to trigger its when attacking ability multiple times, because there really wasn't a whole lot of ace Digimon that decks can or want to use, and now that we have more ace Digimon, that increases the overall defensive capabilities to stem the usage of this card relatively easily. And that's kind of the real reason why that they're allowing this type of card to come back, especially with all new defensive tools constantly being added into the game. So as far as what I'm actually expecting to change out of the meta, basically just the best new decks are going to still be, well, highly playable, on top of just some of the best old decks that aren't necessarily impacted are going to be also still meta relevant because, well, they didn't really lose a whole lot to begin with and they were already this strong. So as far as what I'm actually expecting to do well, Ancient Garurumon or Blue Hybrids is looking to still be one of the better decks. Even though the loss of Ukkomon does hurt it, it's not necessarily the worst thing because we actually do have alternative routes and paths to still be able to utilize Ancient Garurumon in a relatively powerful fashion. Likewise, I also still think Imperial Dramon is absolutely going to be an insane deck because it was already good before and it only just got better thanks to the new tech and tools that BT17 provided it. Mirage is probably going to still be a solid deck just because it's still good now, and it didn't really get impacted by the bans and restrictions, and it still has some really good answers to what the meta is going to be presenting with. And that's kind of also the same type of category on where I'm placing 7 Great Demon Lords. Even though this might cause an increase in Imperial Dramon's popularity, it's just 7 Great Demon Lords is still a very powerful control deck, and on top of that, there's still not a whole lot of counters outside of the fact that we do have Imperial Dramon Paladin mode to try to check the Demon Lord's deck in some capacity. Then, following off of 7 Great Demon Lords, I still think that the blue version of Numon X is going to be really strong. It really didn't use Awakening of the Golden Knight that much. It was a useful card, don't get me wrong, but the deck is still going to be relatively fine just because we do have lots of ways to be able to make up that weakness in blue that yellow kind of just doesn't have, especially since yellow was hit a little bit more than blue this ban and restriction list. I also think that Red Hybrids is still going to be looking to be really strong just because, again, similar reasons why Ancient Garurumon is strong. It's just a deck that can hit really quickly, really hard, scale over big walls. Even if Red's removal types aren't necessarily the greatest, it's still just one of the better aggro decks that we have, and even though Numemon did get some pretty hefty restrictions, I think that the deck is still good enough to be able to adapt just because of the card pool that we have, and we can try to replace the tools that we lost with some small other tech cards that we can include to try to keep the deck's power level relatively high. It might not necessarily be an aggro deck as much, and it might try to shift its focus to be more control orientated. Then, to kind of round out the list, we have the Fenri-Lugomon packages that are going to be ran in, obviously, Fenri-Lugomon, Takamikazuchi, and Dexdoru-Goromon as 2 really powerful decks. Fenri is basically just another OTK deck. It's just taking what it was doing and improving upon it, and Dexdoru-Goromon is another control deck, and it has some really good removal tools for what the meta is asking for, being a good anti-meta deck. Then, as far as how the decks are going to adapt because of the changes in the ban and restriction list, I haven't really done any testing yet to kind of see what is going to be replacing what and what the deck is actually going to end up looking like, especially at the higher competitive level. These are just some basic ideas that I kind of worth playing around with in terms of finding fundamental replacements to what each of the decks are kind of losing. So when it comes comes to the loss of Ukkomons for Numemon, obviously the Ukkomon package is super important because of the Numon egg, so that allows us to try to get quick and easy card draw, and we don't really care about our level 3s too much because we're just going to be hard slamming level 4s most of the time anyway. This core game plan and strategy isn't really going to be changing. With the loss of Ukkomon, we could just run whatever other rookies that we feel would best support what the deck is trying to do. I don't know if the deck is now going to want to shift towards a purple base or if we still want to use black base. Both have their pros and cons, but with black, we do actually have another floodgate that we could potentially run to try to check various other decks in the meta, on top of the fact that we do have Agumon from starter deck 15 as a really good way to have an extra ability to gain us memory. Sure, it's not as easy or great as what Ukkomon is providing, but something is better than nothing. Then when it comes to the loss of Numemon, this one's a little bit harder just because now we don't have as sticky of a board, but we still have other Numemons that we could consider running. The best one that I can think of is probably going to be the RB1 Numemon, or if you really wanted to, you could even think about utilizing the other Jerrymon to try to still discard our Platinum Numemon or discard certain cards, and we could kind of lean a little bit heavier into Venusmon with the security attack minus aspect of the other Jerrymon. But I do think that the RB1 Numemon is just a little bit more appealing. I don't know because of this if we also want to try to run like Shin Manzemon, but that's something again to explore around with because we don't necessarily have that warp potential to get a free Platinum Numemon off of our Numemon X antibody. So there's going to be a little bit of changes there in terms of what you could actually think about utilizing. And as far as the loss of Louie, well, some decks actually just weren't even playing Louie to begin with. The more aggressive decks kind of were, and there's not really a good replacement for it outside of just running literally any other tamer that's going to be good and synergizes with the deck, or just running an option in its place, whether that's a removal option because that's something the deck surely lacks, or just another copy of X Antibody Protoform is again to be determined. Then, when it comes to the changes in Armor Vaccine, this one's a little bit more difficult because there actually was just a lot of cards that were limited and helped to facilitate what this deck was doing. So without more copies of Awaken of the Golden Knight, it is going to be harder to utilize Numon X Antibody because we can't do it off of Rapidmons. So the deck might shift from wanting to utilize more Magnamons to kind of running a better split between Rapidmon X Antibody and Magnamon, and you could still run some level 5s, and you could even bump up what level 5 and how many level 5s to be able to try to take a more traditional evolution route to get to Magnamon X Antibody at the end of the day. So that's kind of just how you could try to incorporate the deck to utilize the lack of Awakening of the Golden Knight, on top of just running other tempo-based option tools to try to help compensate for, again, the loss in the potential to get into Magnamon X Antibody quickly. The loss of TK is going to be a little bit more substantial because this is kind of, like I said before, the glue that's holding Patamon and Emissary of Hope together, because without this TK, you're going to be a lot riskier trying to utilize your security, not necessarily having that great of information, let alone the fact that he's just gaining you memory for when cards are being added back into security. So he's just one of the most efficient tamers that we have at being able to set up our early game, which again is leading to why he got limited. But we could try to at least still utilize the BT1 TK or just some other kind of tamer that's interacting with our security, so we could still try to get that security information and try to set up our security the best that we possibly can, even though it's going to be a little bit harder. So I don't necessarily know if this deck is going to be able to adapt as well or just end up dying just because of the lack of those two cards helping facilitate most of what the deck is trying to do in its current version. But you also do have alternative routes to be able to utilize Magnamon X Antibody. So if you just wanted to scrap the entire yellow vaccine package, you could just try to run some DNA armor base package instead. And then, as I kind of stated before, Numon X Antibody for blue really didn't lose a whole lot, considering we already weren't running a lot of Awakening of the Golden Knight, so you're just going to be replacing Awakening with either more tempo tools or more removal options or just something to help fill the curve. And again, the deck wasn't really running Ukkomon, and when it was running Ukkomon, most of the time it was the BT16 Ukkomon, just to try to help make the deck more consistent. So this, on top of a lot of other blue decks, really didn't get hit too bad, just because Hammer Spark really isn't that needed of a card in a lot of blue decks, and it's more just a byproduct of specific blue decks wanting to take advantage of that. And one of the blue decks that wanted to actually utilize Hammer Spark was Ancient Gabumon. Ancient Gabumon is just a highly flexible card with a whole bunch of different ways to be able to build and approach the deck. I think that the Gabumon package, trying to spam and utilize Louie, is obviously going to be slower. I don't necessarily think it's going to like die or go away. It's just not going to be as efficient because you can't utilize Ancient Gabumon to loop new Louies to reset and move out your Digimon out of the raising, to then spam and trigger Matt Ishida to gain you that memory back to maintain turn and still be able to warp and digivolve again. And this is kind of where Hammer Spark was a more felt hit, just because both of these decks do kind of need the extra memory, and they do have lots of ways to be able to draw cards, which is obviously how you're going to have lots of Hammer Sparks in your hand, just to throw out and spam to be able to extend your combo plays and make your turns that much more powerful and impactful. But I do think that Ancient Gabumon, even without Louie and Hammer Spark, is still going to be a rather strong deck. You still have most of the Ukkomon package, even though, yes, you did get the promo Ukkomon hit. We do have still some really solid bases that we could play for both blue and red. And when it comes to the blue side of things, well, you technically don't even need this promo Ukkomon if you really don't want to, just because we could shift the deck to utilize Strabimons to use in combination with the promo Lobomon to have an extra warp point to digivolve into an Ancient and still do relatively the same exact thing as what we already were trying to do. So it's not like the loss of any of these cards is really that important. It just, again, is here to just try to slow the decks down while keeping them at a relatively playable state, so that way the game can try to open up and let more decks being competitively viable. But all in all, I really do like this ban and restriction list, and I think it's definitely one of the better bans and restrictions we had. I kind of only just wish there was more bans and restrictions, because I do think that other cards kind of do deserve to be banned or limited due to their overall impact and causing further tempo issues with the game, which is a leading reason on why most of the cards get hit in the first place, is because they're too strong and operate too quickly compared to where Digimon wants the game to be as a whole. But regardless, tell me your thoughts about the ban and restriction list down in the comments below. And if you found this video to be helpful and informative, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. And with that, I will see you all in the next video.